Recently, Magnus Carlsen described his second, Daniil Dubov, as one of his chess heroes. It seems like after this game, he might also describe Daniil's opponent in this game, Alireza Firouzja, as one of his heroes. In this position, it looks like the game is about to be drawn. Black is attacking white's knight, and the game has already repeated a few times as the knight has hopped from b8 to a7 and back while being chased by the rook. In fact, the computer indicates that the position's pretty much equal. A draw seems like the fair result, and this match at the World Cup would go to tiebreaks. However, Alireza Firouzja burns his clock. He gets down to 30 seconds, and then he plays one of the most spectacular and competitive moves that I've seen. In this position, he plays the move pawn captures on d6. This spectacular move gives up the knight, and it seems like it's more of an attempt to lose the game than to win the game. I certainly, even with the support of the engine, don't think that I would have the courage to give up the knight on b8 here. It seems like the pawn should be blockaded relatively easily. Daniil takes the knight, which is really forced at this point, and the excellent move rook e1 simply prepares to invade on the 7th rank when the rook is dominating, and these two passed pawns are very dangerous with the support of the rook. Now, it seems like the best defense for Daniil was king to f6, and this does seem very natural. The king is more active on the square, and as you'll see, it gets pinned down if it retreats to the back rank. So by staying off of the back rank, the king has a better potential to stay active, and I think this should most likely lead to a draw. A very fascinating line is pawn to a6, bishop to c6, a7, and here black can try to strike out for counterplay with rook b3. The key for black in this position is you are going to have to give up the bishop for the a pawn, but when you do that, you should get to a drawn rook endgame. For example, rook e8. Of course, the bishop can't take the rook. It only looks to be en prise. And now after we eliminate the b3 pawn, then this drawn endgame could arise. There is an attempt to try to win for white. Actually, rook c8 instead of queening right away creates some great tricks. However, bishop attacks rook, rook attacks bishop, and then bishop goes back. We get this great move d7, but then rook takes rook b6 should still probably lead to a drawn endgame, although white will get an extra pawn here. That's a long computer line, and it indicates how much is hiding in what seems to be a relatively simple endgame position. Going back, after rook e1, Daniil plays king f8, and as said, this seems to create a lot more practical difficulties for black. Now, Alireza invades with rook to e7, and one line I really want to point out is rook b3 trying to go for activity when the excellent move pawn d4, another 2 exclamation mark move in my opinion, creates another passed pawn, and after, for example, the capture of the pawn, rook takes h7, it looks like white should be winning this position. The king is in a really good spot to help deal with this d-pawn if it tries to run for it, and with the rook dominating the 7th rank, it doesn't seem like black's rook and bishop, obviously the king is really out of it, can deal with the 3 passed pawns that white has on the queen side, although of course it's still really complicated. So after rook e7, Daniil tries a slightly more passive move, rook to d8, and the a pawn steps forward. The a pawn's really getting pretty scary at this point. So there's rook takes d6 now. The d pawn is eliminated, and now Alireza has only one pawn for the piece. However, after a7, obviously the a pawn is a pretty important pawn. It's threatening to queen right away, so you only have a few defenses for black. Bishop c6 is basically losing right on the spot because of rook here threatening to capture the bishop and make a queen, and the bishop has nowhere to go. Instead, rook a6 getting behind the passed pawn seems very sensible, but after rook c7, what we're finding out here is that black is starting to get into zugzwang. The bishop can't really move because moving will allow a check on the back rank and a queening of the a pawn. The king is obviously stuck, and black's pawns really don't do anything, so it is zugzwang and white should win. One trick to avoid here is rook takes h7 in this position, which looks great. Let's pick off a pawn and stay on the 7th rank, but this actually loses for white because of bishop f7 and the a pawn falls. If you check down here, we simply have the bishop blocking. Again, this pawn falls, and it's actually black who would win in this case. So it's still possible for white to go wrong. So a7, and now Daniil plays back rook d8. He's picked off the d6 pawn, but he ended up totally tied down in the process, and that's going to be a big problem. Rook b7 is played by Alireza. It looks like rook c7 was slightly more natural, but as I look at it with Stockfish, even though it thinks that rook c7 is better, if you give it more time to think, I think basically the same zugzwings come about in either case. Probably already white is winning. So after bishop c6 here, the rook goes to c7. The bishop now tries to go to e8. If it goes to a8, there's rook take h7. You're just picking off another pawn and still dominating. And after it goes to e8, simply the white king starts to invade. This is the zugzwang that I'm talking about. As the white king steps up the board, black's bishop and king are really totally trapped. Even the rook on d8 is trapped at this point. You're going to run out of pawn moves, and eventually you're going to lose the game. Black tries g5, king e3, pawn h6, and you're not able to really improve in this position by stepping up with the king because of bishop checks, but you can simply play a waiting move like g3 and pass the move back to black. Now, bishop g6 goes after the d3 pawn, but going after the d3 pawn is not enough, and Alireza plays rook b7, simply going for rook b8 and queening the a pawn. He lets d3 go to get that done, and after the basically 4 sequence that results, he picks up an exchange, and although it's not easy to win this position, this is a winning endgame, and Alireza demonstrated excellent technique and did convert this endgame. I even feel like he had a very similar endgame he won at the World Blitz Championship, although I can't remember his opponent, where he also converted an exchange up endgame like this. I hope that you have enjoyed this this position and this fantastic idea of e takes d6, one of the most aggressive competitive ideas in a position where you didn't need to win. You could have had a draw and gone to tie breaks that I have seen. I hope that you're also as excited as I am to see what Alireza does in future, and hopefully to see him contend for the World Championship title. If you like this video, please subscribe and check out more examples in our playlists. Most of them are much shorter than this one.